My name is Patricia Ciavarella, and for 8 years, I was married to one of America's most respected juvenile court judges. Mark Ciavarella was known as tough but fair. Parents trusted him. Politicians praised him. Other judges respected him. He was supposed to protect children. Instead, he sold them. For $2.8 million in bribes, my husband sent over 4,000 children to private prisons for crimes they didn't commit. He destroyed families. He ruined lives. He turned childhood mistakes into profitable commodities. And I helped him hide it. Until the night I found a briefcase full of cash in our bedroom closet, and realized that the man I loved was trafficking children for money. This is how I discovered my husband was a monster. And why I finally chose other people's children over my own marriage. People always ask me, how could you not know? How could you live with someone for 8 years and not realize they were destroying children? The answer is simple. I saw what I wanted to see. I believed what I needed to believe. Because when you love someone, when you've built a life with them, when you trust them completely, you find ways to explain away the things that don't make sense. Even when those things should have been obvious. I met Mark in 1995 at a community fundraiser in Wilkes-Barre. I was 28, working as a paralegal at a family law firm. He was 31, a prosecutor with political ambitions and the kind of confidence that made people listen when he spoke. I want to be a judge someday, he told me on our second date. I want to help kids who've made mistakes get back on the right path. Too many children are being failed by the system. I fell in love with his passion for justice. With his desire to protect vulnerable people. With his dream of making the world better for children who needed guidance instead of punishment. God help me, I believed every word. We married in 1997. Mark was still a prosecutor then, but he was already building his reputation as someone who cared about juvenile justice. He'd volunteer at youth centers, speak at schools about staying out of trouble, mentor young lawyers who wanted to work in family court. Kids aren't born criminals, he'd tell me. They make mistakes because they don't have proper guidance. A good judge can change a child's entire life trajectory. When he decided to run for juvenile court judge in 2003, I was his biggest supporter. I helped with his campaign, organized fundraisers, spoke to community groups about his vision for reforming the system. His campaign slogan was protecting our children, securing our future. I was so proud of him. I thought we were going to change the world. Mark won the election in a landslide. Parents loved his tough-on-crime message combined with his commitment to rehabilitation. Politicians appreciated his law-and-order approach. The media praised his innovative programs for at-risk youth. Judge Mark Ciavarella was everything Luzerne County wanted in a juvenile court judge: firm but compassionate, strict but fair, someone who would hold children accountable while giving them chances to turn their lives around. At least, that's what everyone believed. Including me. The first year was everything we'd hoped for. Mark threw himself into the work with passion. He'd come home excited about cases where he'd helped kids get into treatment programs instead of jail. He'd talk about connecting families with social services. He'd beam with pride when telling me about children who'd turned their lives around after appearing in his court. "This is what I was meant to do, Patricia," he'd say. "Every kid who doesn't end up in the system is a victory. Every family I keep together is a life changed." I was so in love with his dedication. So proud of his impact. So convinced that we were part of something important. I had no idea that everything he was telling me was a lie. The changes started small. Subtle shifts that I rationalized away because I wanted to believe the best about my husband. In 2004, Mark started working longer hours. More cases, he'd explain. The county is growing, and more kids need help. He began traveling to conferences more frequently. Staying current with best practices, he'd say. Learning about new rehabilitation programs. He started receiving calls at home that he'd taken his study with the door closed. Sensitive cases, he'd tell me. Can't discuss details because of confidentiality. And then there was the money. We'd always lived comfortably on Mark's judicial salary, but nothing extravagant. A nice house in a good neighborhood, reliable cars, modest vacations. But in 2005, things changed. Mark started talking about investment opportunities that were paying off. Expensive dinners became more frequent. Our vacations became more luxurious. He bought a boat, then a second car, then started renovating our house with high-end materials. I've been making some smart investments, he'd explain when I asked about our increased spending. Real estate, some consulting work on the side. We deserve to enjoy the fruits of our hard work. I didn't question it. Judges made good money, and Mark had always been smart about finances. I trusted him completely. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded to see where the money was coming from. I should have realized that no judicial salary could support the lifestyle we were suddenly living. But I didn't want to doubt the man I loved. So I convinced myself that everything was legitimate. 2005 was the year Mark's courtroom changed. Not dramatically, nothing that would raise immediate red flags. But looking back, that's when the zero-tolerance policies began. Mark had always been firm with repeat offenders, but now he was getting tough with first-time offenders too. Kids who'd previously gotten community service were being sent to detention centers. Minor infractions that used to result in warnings were now leading to residential placements. I'm seeing too many kids who think they can get away with anything, Mark explained when I asked about the shift. Sometimes you have to send a strong message early to prevent bigger problems later. But it wasn't just the increased sentences that worried me. It was how Mark talked about the children who appeared in his court. He used to come home with stories about individual kids, their backgrounds, their struggles, their potential for rehabilitation. He'd spend hours researching programs that might help specific children. Now he talked about them differently. They weren't individuals with unique circumstances. They were problems to be solved, examples to be made, lessons for other kids who might be watching. You can't save everyone, Patricia, he'd tell me when I expressed concern about a particularly harsh sentence. Some kids need to learn that actions have consequences. Better they learn it now than when they're adults and the stakes are higher. The statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. Under Mark's leadership, Luzerne County was sending more children to residential facilities than any other county in Pennsylvania. Our detention rates were 300% higher than the state average. When local newspapers started asking questions, Mark had ready answers. We're finally holding kids accountable, he'd tell reporters. Previous judges were too lenient. I'm teaching children that there are consequences for bad choices. The community ate it up. Parents loved hearing about a judge who was tough on juvenile crime. Politicians praised his innovative approach to accountability. Law enforcement appreciated having a judge who supported their efforts to maintain order. But I was starting to see the human cost. At community events, I'd meet parents whose children had been sentenced by Mark. They'd approach me hesitantly, not wanting to offend the judge's wife, but desperate to understand why their kids had received such harsh punishments for minor offenses. Sarah Mitchell's son had been sent to a residential facility for 6 months for truancy. He was skipping school because he was being bullied, she told me. I begged the judge to consider counseling instead of detention. But your husband said that making excuses would only enable future criminal behavior. David Rodriguez's daughter had been sentenced to 9 months in a youth center for fighting at school. It was her first offense, David explained. She was defending a younger kid from bullies. But Judge Ciavarella said that violence was violence, regardless of the motivation. I started keeping track of the stories I was hearing. Kids sentenced to months in detention for first-time marijuana possession, skipping school, minor shoplifting, underage drinking, talking back to teachers, missing curfew. These weren't hardened criminals. They were children making normal teenage mistakes. The kinds of mistakes that used to result in lectures and community service were now leading to months of incarceration. When I tried to discuss this with Mark, he'd get defensive. "You're hearing one side of the story," he'd argue. "These parents don't want to admit that their children have serious behavioral problems. They'd rather blame me than take responsibility for their kids' actions." But the turning point came in 2006 with the case of Hillary Transu. Hillary was a 14-year-old honor student who'd created a fake MySpace page mocking her assistant principal. It was typical teenage behavior, immature and disrespectful, but hardly criminal. Hillary appeared in Mark's court expecting a lecture and maybe some community service. Instead, Mark sentenced her to 3 months in a youth detention center. 3 months. For a MySpace page. Hillary's parents were devastated. "She's never been in trouble before," her mother pleaded. "She's a good kid who made a stupid mistake. Please reconsider." But Mark was unmoved. "Miss Transu needs to learn that her actions have consequences. Cyberbullying is a serious offense that can destroy lives. This sentence will ensure she thinks twice before engaging in this behavior again." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Hillary Transu, a child the same age as my niece, being locked up for making a joke website. "Don't you think 3 months was excessive?" I asked Mark the next morning. "Hillary Transu is a bully who was using technology to humiliate an adult," he replied. "If I don't send a strong message about cyberbullying now, we'll have an epidemic of children thinking they can destroy people's reputations without consequences." But there was something in his tone, a coldness I'd never heard before. Like he was reciting a script rather than expressing genuine concern about a child's welfare. That's when I first wondered if something was seriously wrong with my husband. Over the next year, the pattern became undeniable. Mark wasn't just being tough on crime, he was systematically sending children to detention facilities for offenses that had never resulted in incarceration before. And the demographics were telling. 85% of the children he was sentencing to residential placement were from low-income families. 78% were from single-parent homes. 67% were minorities. Wealthy kids with private attorneys were getting probation for the same offenses that sent poor kids to detention centers. When I pointed this out to Mark, he had an explanation ready. "Wealthy families have resources to address their children's behavioral problems," he said. "Poor families don't. Sometimes the state has to step in to provide the structure and discipline that these kids aren't getting at home." But I was beginning to realize that Mark's explanations always sounded reasonable on the surface while being fundamentally wrong underneath. And I was about to discover just how wrong they really were. December 15th, 2007. The night that changed everything. Mark was at what he called a judicial conference in Harrisburg, his 3rd conference that month. I was home alone, wrapping Christmas presents in our bedroom when I accidentally knocked over a stack of law books on Mark's dresser. Behind the books was a briefcase I'd never seen before. It was locked, but I knew where Mark kept his keys. I told myself I was just curious about what legal documents he might be storing. I told myself I had a right to know what my husband was keeping in our bedroom. I told myself a lot of things to justify opening that briefcase. Inside was $50,000 in cash. And documents that would destroy everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married. The documents were contracts between Mark and something called PA Child Care, a private company that operated juvenile detention facilities. But these weren't normal judicial contracts about facility standards or treatment programs. They were payment agreements. PA Child Care was paying Mark $1,000 for every child he sent to their facilities. There were monthly tallies showing how many kids had been sentenced, how much money Mark had earned, and projections for future placements. It wasn't justice. It wasn't rehabilitation. It wasn't about helping children or protecting the community. My husband was being paid to send children to prison. He was trafficking kids for money. I sat on our bedroom floor, surrounded by cash and contracts, and felt my entire world collapse. Every harsh sentence made sense now. Every zero-tolerance policy had a financial motive. Every child Mark had sent away had put money in his pocket, money that had paid for our vacations, our renovations, our comfortable lifestyle. I had been living off the suffering of children. And I had never questioned where the money was coming from. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the targeting. The documents included demographic analyses showing which types of children were most profitable to incarcerate. Poor kids stayed longer because their families couldn't afford appeals. Minority children were less likely to have political connections that might cause problems. First-time offenders were easier to sentence harshly because they and their families didn't understand the system well enough to fight back. Mark wasn't just taking bribes. He was systematically targeting the most vulnerable children in our community for financial exploitation. He had turned the juvenile justice system into a human trafficking operation. I spent 3 hours going through every document in that briefcase. What I found was evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond Mark's courtroom. There were other judges involved. County officials who were facilitating the scheme. Probation officers who were recommending detention for children who should have been released. Court administrators who were manipulating case assignments to ensure that certain kids appeared before cooperative judges. The entire juvenile justice system in Luzerne County had been corrupted by private prison money. And my husband was at the center of it all. When Mark came home the next evening, I was waiting for him in his study. The briefcase was on his desk, open, with the cash and contracts spread out in front of me. He froze in the doorway when he saw what I'd discovered. "Patricia, I can explain dash." "Explain what, Mark?" "Explain how you've been selling children for money? Explain how our entire lifestyle has been funded by destroying families? Explain how the man I married became a child trafficker?" He closed the door and sat down across from me. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with, someone who looked ashamed and sorry and lost. Then his expression hardened, and I realized that man was gone. "You don't understand the system, Patricia," he said calmly. "These aren't good kids from good families. These are troubled children who need structure and discipline. The detention centers provide services that their families can't afford. I'm helping them." "You're helping them by taking money to send them to prison?" "I'm helping them by making sure they get the intervention they need before they become adult criminals. The money is irrelevant, it's compensation for the difficult decisions I have to make." I stared at my husband and realized he actually believed what he was saying. He had convinced himself that trafficking children was a form of social service. "What about Hillary Transu?" I asked. "What about all the kids who've been sent away for minor offenses? How is destroying their lives helping them?" Hillary Transu needed to learn that actions have consequences. All of these children did. Their parents failed to teach them respect and accountability, so the system had to step in. The system didn't step in, Mark. You stepped in. You specifically. Because you were being paid to. The money doesn't change the fact that these kids needed help. The money is the fact, Mark. You're not helping these children. You're exploiting them. You're destroying their lives for profit." That's when Mark said something that made my blood run cold. "Patricia, If you think you can use this information to threaten me, you're making a serious mistake. There are powerful people involved in this arrangement. People who don't appreciate interference from outsiders who don't understand the big picture. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. For your own safety. There are things about this situation that you don't understand. Things that could be dangerous if you started asking the wrong questions. I realized in that moment that my husband wasn't just corrupt. He was dangerous. And I was in danger. Over the next week, I did something I'd never thought I'd have to do. I investigated my own husband. I copied documents from his study. I recorded our conversations. I researched PA Child Care and discovered it was owned by Robert Miracle and Robert Powell, businessmen with connections to organized crime. I found evidence that the conspiracy reached into the Pennsylvania state government. That judges across multiple counties were taking bribes. That the private prison industry had corrupted the entire juvenile justice system. Mark wasn't just a corrupt judge. He was part of a criminal organization that was trafficking children on an industrial scale. But the discovery that broke my heart happened on Christmas Eve, 2007. I was looking through Mark's calendar, trying to understand the scope of his criminal activities, when I found entries that made me realize just how deep his corruption ran. Christmas Eve sentencing review, 47 placements confirmed for holiday period. January quotas exceeded by 23%. My husband was tracking child incarcerations like a sales manager tracking quarterly profits. He had quotas to meet. Children to deliver. Families to destroy. And he was doing it on Christmas Eve. That night, as we sat around our Christmas tree exchanging gifts, I looked at my husband and saw a stranger. Every smile was fake. Every I love you was hollow. Every moment of apparent happiness was built on the suffering of children. I had to make a choice, stay silent and remain complicit in child trafficking, or speak out and destroy the only life I'd ever known. For 3 more months, I chose silence. And every day I stayed quiet, more children were sent away to make my husband richer. January through March 2008 were the longest 3 months of my life. Every morning, I'd wake up next to a man who trafficked children for money. Every evening, I'd sit down to dinner with someone who had destroyed dozens of families that day. And I said nothing. I told myself I needed more evidence. I convinced myself I needed to be absolutely certain before I acted. I rationalized my silence by claiming I was protecting myself from dangerous people. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was a coward. During those 3 months, Mark sentenced 127 children to residential detention. 127 kids whose only crime was being poor, vulnerable, and unlucky enough to appear in his courtroom. I knew about every single one of them. Because I was tracking Mark's activities, documenting his crimes, building a case that I was too scared to present to anyone. Every night, I'd update my records. January 15th, Tommy Rodriguez, age 16, sentenced to 8 months for marijuana possession. First offense. January 22nd, Ashley Williams, age 14, sentenced to 6 months for shoplifting. Value of stolen items, $30. February 3rd, Michael Chun, age 15, sentenced to 10 months for fighting at school. No previous arrests. I knew their names. I knew their ages. I knew their stories. And I did nothing to help them. The worst part was watching Mark at home during this period. He wasn't tormented by guilt or struggling with moral conflicts. He was thriving. He'd come home excited about productive days in court. He'd brag about sending strong messages to the community. He'd count his money with the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd earned every dollar. We had 23 placements this week, he told me one Friday evening, as casually as another husband might discuss his golf score. That's a new record. The community is finally taking juvenile crime seriously. I started having nightmares about the children Mark was destroying. I'd dream about Hillary Transu crying in a detention cell. I'd wake up thinking about Tommy Rodriguez missing his high school graduation. I'd lie awake calculating how many families were being torn apart to pay for our comfortable lifestyle. But I still didn't act. Because acting meant admitting that I'd been complicit. That I'd benefited from child trafficking. That I'd helped my husband hide his crimes by playing the role of the supportive judge's wife. The breaking point came on March 18, 2008, when I met Lisa Sullivan. Lisa was the mother of Kevin Sullivan, a 17-year-old who'd been sentenced by Mark to 11 months in detention for underage drinking. Kevin had been at a party where police had arrested several teenagers. Most of the kids had received fines and community service from other judges. But Kevin had been unlucky enough to appear in Mark's courtroom. Lisa cornered me at a grocery store, desperate and broken. "Mrs. Ciavarella, please," she begged. "Kevin is going to miss his senior year. He's going to lose his college scholarship. His whole future is being destroyed for one mistake. Can you talk to your husband? Can you ask him to reconsider?" I looked at this mother, this woman whose son I could have saved with a single phone call, and realized I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't explain that her son hadn't been sentenced for underage drinking. He'd been sentenced because Mark needed to meet his quota for PA child care. He'd been sentenced because his incarceration was worth $1,000 to my husband. I couldn't tell her that Kevin Sullivan wasn't being rehabilitated. He was being sold. That night, I made a decision that would destroy my marriage and save my soul. I called the FBI. But even then, I didn't do it the right way. I should have walked into the FBI field office and demanded to speak with the agent in charge. I should have brought my evidence and confessed everything I knew. Instead, I made an anonymous call to the FBI tip line. "I have information about judicial corruption in Luzerne County," I said, my voice shaking. "Judge Mark Ciavarella is taking bribes to send children to private detention facilities. Can you provide documentation of these allegations?" "Yes. But I need guarantees that my identity will be protected." "Ma'am, we can't guarantee anonymity, but we can discuss protective measures if you're willing to cooperate with an investigation." I hung up. I was still too much of a coward to do the right thing completely. But that anonymous call started something I couldn't control. 3 weeks later, FBI agents began investigating Mark's financial records. They started asking questions about his relationship with PA child care. They began reviewing his sentencing patterns. And Mark started getting paranoid. "Someone's been asking questions about my cases," he told me one evening in April. "The FBI has been sniffing around the courthouse. Probably some disgruntled parent who doesn't want to accept that their kid is a criminal." "What kind of questions?" "Financial questions. Questions about PA child care. Questions about my sentencing decisions." He looked at me suspiciously. "You haven't talked to anyone about my work, have you, Patricia? You haven't shared any information about court business with outsiders?" "Of course not," I lied. But I could tell Mark was starting to suspect that someone close to him was cooperating with the investigation. And I was terrified that he was going to figure out it was me. May 2008. The FBI contacted me directly. Agent Rebecca Martinez called me at work, identifying herself as a federal investigator looking into corruption in the Pennsylvania juvenile justice system. "Mrs. Ciavarella, we'd like to speak with you about your husband's court operations. Would you be willing to meet with us?" "I don't know anything about my husband's work," I said automatically. "Mrs. Ciavarella, we have reason to believe that you might have more information than you realize. Information that could help us protect children who are being harmed by systemic corruption. That phrase, protect children, broke something inside me. When do you want to meet? I asked. May 15, 2008. FBI Field Office, Scranton, Pennsylvania. The most terrifying and liberating day of my life. I sat across from Agent Martinez and Agent Thompson, with a briefcase full of evidence that would destroy my husband and save hundreds of children. Mrs. Ciavarella, Agent Martinez began, before we start, I need you to understand the seriousness of what you're doing. If your husband is guilty of the crimes we suspect, your testimony could result in federal charges, lengthy prison sentences, and the complete dismantling of the Luzerne County juvenile justice system. I understand. And I need you to understand that once you provide this information, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over. Your life as you know it will be over. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Kevin Sullivan missing his senior year. I thought about Hillary Transu in a detention cell. I thought about the 127 children Mark had trafficked during my 3 months of cowardice. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. For 8 hours, I told the FBI everything I knew about Mark's criminal operation. I provided them with financial records showing payments from PA Child Care, documents outlining the child trafficking conspiracy, audio recordings of Mark discussing his criminal activities, evidence of the systematic targeting of vulnerable children, names of other officials involved in the corruption, proof of the quota system for child incarcerations. But the most valuable thing I gave them was ongoing access to Mark's activities. Agent Martinez explained what they needed from me. Mrs. Ciavarella, your husband is part of a criminal organization that we believe extends far beyond Luzerne County. We need real-time intelligence about his communications, his meetings, his financial transactions. Would you be willing to cooperate with an ongoing surveillance operation? What would that involve? Wearing recording devices during conversations with your husband. Copying documents from his office. Reporting on his activities and communications. Essentially, you'd be working as an undercover informant. The word informant hit me like a physical blow. That's what I was becoming, someone who betrayed their own family for the FBI. But Agent Thompson put it in perspective. Mrs. Ciavarella, your husband has destroyed the lives of over 2,000 children during his time on the bench. Every day you help us gather evidence is a day we get closer to stopping him. Every conversation you record might save dozens of kids from being trafficked into detention. What about my safety? Mark said there were dangerous people involved in this conspiracy. We'll provide protection. But I won't lie to you, there are risks. Your husband is connected to organized crime figures who don't hesitate to eliminate threats. I realized I was choosing between my safety and the safety of children I'd never met. It wasn't really a choice at all. For the next 6 months, I lived a double life that nearly destroyed my sanity. During the day, I played the role of the supportive judge's wife. I attended court functions, hosted dinner parties for Mark's judicial colleagues, and smiled while people praised my husband's innovative approach to juvenile justice. During the evening, I recorded our conversations, copied his documents, and reported his activities to the FBI. I was betraying my husband every single day while pretending to love and support him. The recordings revealed the full scope of Mark's criminal empire. Conversations about coordinating with other corrupt judges to maximize child incarcerations, planning to eliminate witnesses who might threaten the operation, laundering bribe money through fake consulting contracts, pressuring probation officers to recommend detention for profitable cases, threatening defense attorneys who tried to appeal harsh sentences. Mark wasn't just taking bribes. He was running a sophisticated criminal organization that had corrupted every level of the juvenile justice system. But the most damning evidence came from a conversation I recorded in September 2008. Mark was meeting with Robert Powell, one of the owners of PA Child Care, in our living room. I was wearing an FBI wire hidden in my jewelry. "We need to increase placement numbers," Powell said. "The investors are expecting 15% growth in the fourth quarter." "I can't just start sentencing more kids without justification," Mark replied. "People are already asking questions about my sentencing patterns." "Then find justifications. Expand the criteria for detention. Target kids from families that won't cause problems. Make it look like you're responding to an increase in juvenile crime." "What about the FBI investigation?" "Handled. We have people inside the federal system who are monitoring the situation. If it becomes a real threat, we'll know in advance." That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. Mark's criminal organization had infiltrated federal law enforcement. There were corrupt FBI agents and federal prosecutors who were protecting the child trafficking operation. Agent Martinez wasn't surprised when I reported this. "We suspected there were leaks," she said. "That's why this investigation is being run by a small team of agents who've been specifically cleared for this operation. Your husband's people don't know how close we are to bringing down the entire network." October 2008. The FBI asked me to do something that terrified me more than anything I'd done so far. "We need you to help us plant surveillance equipment in your husband's courthouse office," Agent Thompson explained. "The recordings from your home are valuable, but we need to capture his communications with other judges, court officials, and the private prison representatives. If he catches me." "He won't. The equipment is virtually undetectable, and you have legitimate reasons to be in his office." "But Patricia, I need you to understand, once we have recordings from his office, we'll have enough evidence to arrest him. This will be the end of your cooperation because it will be the end of his freedom." November 3, 2008. I planted FBI surveillance equipment in Mark's courthouse office while he was in a sentencing hearing. It was the most terrifying 15 minutes of my life. Every sound in the hallway made me think I was about to be caught. Every footstep made me think Mark was coming back early. But I did it. Because I knew that every day Mark remained free, more children would be trafficked into detention for his profit. The office recordings captured conversations that exceeded even the FBI's expectations. Mark discussing plans to murder a probation officer who was threatening to expose the conspiracy. Strategies for intimidating families who were appealing his sentences. Methods for laundering bribe money through his campaign fund. Coordination with organized crime figures who were investors in PA Child Care. Arrangements to have defense attorneys disbarred if they caused problems. My husband wasn't just corrupt. He was a dangerous criminal who was willing to commit murder to protect his child trafficking operation. December 15, 2008. Exactly 1 year after I discovered the cash in our bedroom, Agent Martinez called me with news that would change everything. "Patricia, we're executing arrest warrants tomorrow morning. Your husband and 15 co-conspirators will be taken into custody simultaneously. You need to be prepared for your life to change completely." "What should I do?" "Pack essential items and be ready to leave your house immediately after the arrests. There will be media coverage, angry supporters of your husband, and potentially dangerous retaliation from his criminal associates. We'll provide protection until you can establish a new life somewhere safe." I realized that in helping the FBI destroy Mark's criminal empire, I was also destroying the only life I'd ever known. December 16, 2008. 6:47 a.m. I was making coffee when I heard the cars pull up outside our house. Through the kitchen window, I watched FBI agents surround our home while other agents entered the courthouse where Mark was preparing for his morning docket. Agent Martinez had given me a secure phone to monitor the operation. At exactly 7 a.m., I received a text message, "Package delivered." Judge Mark Ciavarella, my husband of 11 years, had been arrested for child trafficking. The media coverage was immediate and overwhelming. Pennsylvania judge arrested in child trafficking scandal. Kids for cash, judge sold children to private prisons. Massive corruption in juvenile justice system exposed. By noon, our house was surrounded by news vans, protesters, and curiosity seekers. The FBI moved me to a safe house while investigators searched our home and seized Mark's assets. That evening, I watched my husband appear in federal court for his arraignment. Seeing the man I'd loved in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit was the most devastating moment of my life. But the arrests were just the beginning. Over the next weeks, the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. Mark and his co-conspirator Judge Michael Conahan had received $2.8 million in bribes. They had trafficked over 4,000 children into private detention facilities. The conspiracy had involved county commissioners, court administrators, probation officers, and private prison executives. Children as young as 10 had been sentenced to months in detention for minor infractions. Families had been destroyed, educations had been ruined, and some children had committed suicide as a result of their traumatic detention experiences. My husband hadn't just been taking bribes. He had been the leader of the largest child trafficking operation in American judicial history. The human cost was overwhelming. During the investigation, the FBI interviewed over 500 families whose children had been victims of Mark's trafficking operation. Stories like a 12-year-old girl who'd been sentenced to 6 months for fighting with her mother. A 13-year-old boy who'd attempted suicide after being detained for riding a stolen bicycle. A 15-year-old who'd been sentenced to a year in detention for writing graffiti. Dozens of children who'd missed graduations, lost scholarships, or developed PTSD from their detention experiences. Every victim represented a child whose life had been destroyed to put money in my husband's pocket. Money that had paid for our vacations, our house, our comfortable lifestyle. The guilt was unbearable. I had lived off the suffering of children for years without asking questions. I had benefited from a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed thousands of families. Even though I'd eventually done the right thing, I would never be able to undo the damage that had been done while I stayed silent. Mark's trial began in February 2011, 2.5 years after his arrest. I testified for 3 days, describing in detail how I discovered his criminal activities and cooperated with the FBI investigation. Mark's defense team tried to portray me as a vindictive wife who was lying to get revenge for some imagined slight. They claimed I'd fabricated evidence and coached the FBI to build a false case against my husband. But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, audio recordings, surveillance footage, and testimony from dozens of co-conspirators painted a clear picture of Mark's guilt. On February 18, 2011, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges: racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, federal tax evasion, violation of civil rights under color of law. Judge Mark Ciavarella was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Judge Michael Conahan received 17.5 years. Robert Powell and the other private prison executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. It was the largest judicial corruption conviction in American history. But the convictions couldn't undo the damage. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned over 4,000 juvenile adjudications, acknowledging that thousands of children had been illegally detained. Victim compensation funds were established, but no amount of money could restore the childhoods that had been stolen or repair the families that had been destroyed. And nothing could give me back the life I'd lost by choosing to expose the man I'd loved. The personal cost was devastating. I lost everything: my marriage, my home, my community, my identity. Mark's supporters blamed me for destroying a good man who had been tough but fair with juvenile criminals. They claimed I'd been brainwashed by the FBI or that I was seeking attention by fabricating stories about my husband. Even some of the victims' families resented me for not coming forward sooner. If you'd spoken up in 2007, one mother told me, my son wouldn't have spent 8 months in detention for shoplifting candy. She was right. My 3 months of cowardice had cost children their freedom. I moved to a different state, changed my name, and tried to build a new life. But the guilt followed me everywhere. Every news story about Mark's conviction reminded me of my complicity. Every interview with victims' families made me relive my failure to act sooner. Every night, I'd lie awake calculating how many children could have been saved if I'd found my courage earlier. Mark died in federal prison in 2019, 7 years into his 28-year sentence. He was 69 years old. I didn't attend his funeral. I wasn't welcome, and honestly, I didn't know how to mourn someone who had been both the love of my life and a monster who destroyed children. But his death forced me to confront a difficult truth. Part of me had never stopped loving the man I thought he was, even after learning who he really was. The last 10 years have been about trying to find redemption for my failures. I've worked with organizations that advocate for juvenile justice reform. I've helped families navigate the legal system when their children are mistreated by authorities. I've testified before legislative committees about the need for oversight of private prison companies. I'll never be able to undo the damage caused by my years of silence, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to prevent other Mark Ciavarellas from rising to power. In 2015, I received a letter that changed my perspective on everything I'd done. It was from Hilary Transu, the 14-year-old who'd been sentenced to 3 months in detention for creating a MySpace page. Mrs. Ciavarella, she wrote, I know you're suffering because of what you did to your husband. I know you've lost everything because you chose to help people like me. I want you to know that I'm in college now, studying social work, because I want to help kids who are being failed by the system. I'm able to do that because you found the courage to stop your husband from destroying more lives. You saved me and thousands of other children. Thank you. I still have that letter. I read it whenever I doubt whether destroying my marriage was worth it. And every time, I come to the same conclusion, saving Hilary Transu was worth losing Mark Ciavarella. The most important lesson I've learned is that evil often disguises itself as good intentions. Mark convinced himself that he was helping troubled children by giving them structure and discipline. He rationalized his crimes by claiming he was protecting society from future criminals. He justified his corruption by arguing that the ends justified the means. But helping children doesn't require destroying their lives. Protecting society doesn't require trafficking vulnerable kids for profit. And no amount of good intentions can justify the systematic abuse of power. I've also learned that complicity has consequences that last forever. Every day I stayed silent about Mark's crimes was a day that more children were trafficked into detention. Every month I failed to act was a month that more families were destroyed. Every year I chose loyalty over justice was a year that more vulnerable kids were exploited for profit. The children who suffered during my silence deserved better from me. They deserved someone who would choose their welfare over her own comfort. They deserved someone who would act immediately instead of waiting for courage to arrive. But I've also learned that it's never too late to do the right thing. When I finally found the courage to expose Mark's crimes, it saved thousands of children from being trafficked. It dismantled a criminal organization that had corrupted an entire justice system. It sent a message that even the most powerful officials can be held accountable for their crimes. One person's decision to speak truth to power can change everything. Today, juvenile justice reform continues across America. Private prison companies face increased scrutiny. Judicial oversight has been strengthened. And families have more resources to fight back when their children are mistreated by the system. Mark's legacy isn't just the lives he destroyed, it's also the reforms that followed his downfall. The system that enabled his crimes has been changed to make future Mark Ciavarellas impossible. My name is Patricia Ciavarella. I was married to Judge Mark Ciavarella, one of the most corrupt judicial officials in American history. For 8 years, I lived with a man who trafficked children for money. For 11 months, I knew about his crimes and did nothing. For 6 months, I helped the FBI gather evidence that sent him to prison for the rest of his life. I chose justice over family. I chose strangers' children over my own husband. I chose doing what was right over doing what was easy. And if I had to make that choice again, knowing everything I know now about the cost, I would make the same decision. Because some secrets are too evil to keep. Because some crimes are too horrible to hide. Because protecting children is more important than protecting the people who hurt them, even when those people are the ones we love most. If you're watching this because you know about corruption, because you've witnessed abuse of power, because you're struggling with whether to speak out, I want you to know that it's possible. It will cost you everything. You will lose people you love. You will be called a traitor, a liar, a troublemaker. But you will also save lives. You will stop evil. You will sleep at night knowing that you chose courage over comfort. And sometimes, that's the only choice that matters. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about justice. And thank you for remembering that the most important thing we can do in life is protect children from the people who would hurt them, no matter who those people are.